Marcus Thompson had always been a troublemaker. At 28, he had a long history of causing problems wherever he went. His friends often joked that he could start a fight in an empty room. On this particular Tuesday morning in London, Marcus woke up with a headache and a bad attitude that would soon get him into more trouble than he had ever imagined. The sun was shining brightly as Marcus walked down the busy streets near Buckingham Palace. He had been drinking heavily the night before and was still feeling the effects. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was messy, and he smelled like alcohol. People on the street moved away from him as he stumbled along the sidewalk. Marcus had lost his job at the construction site 3 weeks ago after getting into a fight with his supervisor. Since then, he had been spending his days drinking and causing trouble around the city. His girlfriend had left him, his friends were tired of his behavior, and his family had stopped taking his calls. He felt angry at the world and wanted someone to blame for his problems. As he approached the famous palace, Marcus noticed the crowds of tourists taking pictures and admiring the beautiful building. The sight of all these happy people made him even more angry. He watched as families smiled and posed for photos, couples held hands and laughed, and children pointed excitedly at the guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. The royal guards stood perfectly still at their posts, like living statues. Their faces showed no emotion, and they stared straight ahead without moving. Marcus had heard stories about these guards and how they were trained never to react to anything. People said they were like robots, completely focused on their duty, to protect the palace and the royal family. Marcus stopped walking and stared at one particular guard who was standing near the main gate. The guard was young, probably in his early 20s, with a serious expression on his face. His uniform was perfectly clean and pressed, his boots were polished until they shined, and his rifle was held exactly as it should be. Everything about him represented order, discipline, and respect. Everything that Marcus felt was missing from his own life. A dangerous idea began to form in Marcus's mind. He had always been told that these guards would not react no matter what happened. People said they were trained to ignore everything around them, even if someone tried to bother them. Marcus wondered if this was really true. Maybe if he could make one of these perfect guards lose his composure, it would make him feel better about his own failures. Marcus moved closer to the guard, staying just outside the rope barriers that kept tourists at a safe distance. He stood there for several minutes, studying the young man's face for any sign of movement or expression. The guard's eyes remained fixed on a point in the distance, and he showed no sign that he had even noticed Marcus's presence. Other tourists began to notice Marcus as he stood there staring at the guard. Some moved away, sensing that something was not quite right about the disheveled man. A few took pictures, thinking he might be part of some kind of performance or tourist attraction. Marcus enjoyed the attention and felt more confident about what he was planning to do. The morning grew warmer as more people arrived to see the palace. Tour buses unloaded groups of visitors from around the world, all eager to experience this famous piece of British history. Street vendors sold souvenirs and snacks, children ran around excitedly, and the atmosphere was filled with joy and wonder. But Marcus felt none of this happiness. Instead, he felt only the growing urge to disrupt the peaceful scene and make someone else feel as miserable as he did. Marcus decided to test the guard's patience with small actions at first. He started by making loud comments about the guard's appearance, hoping to get some kind of reaction. He called out things like, "Hey, statue boy, can you even blink?" and "Look at this robot pretending to be human." The guard remained completely motionless, giving no sign that he had heard anything. Encouraged by the lack of response, Marcus became bolder. He began making silly faces and gestures at the guard, trying to make him smile or look annoyed. He danced around like a clown, made rude noises, and even pretended to trip and fall dramatically near the guard's post. Each time, the young soldier maintained his perfect posture and blank expression. Other tourists started to gather around, some laughing at Marcus's antics while others looked uncomfortable. A few people took out their phones to record what was happening, thinking it might be entertaining to share on social media. Marcus loved being the center of attention and felt more confident with each passing minute. As the crowd grew larger, Marcus decided to escalate his behavior. He moved even closer to the guard, staying just barely within the allowed area. He started making personal comments about the guard's family, his intelligence, and his appearance. The words that came out of Marcus's mouth grew more insulting and cruel, but still the guard showed no reaction whatsoever. Marcus began to feel frustrated. He had expected to break the guard's concentration by now, but the young man seemed completely immune to his harassment. This only made Marcus more determined to succeed. He started shouting louder, using language that made many tourists cover their children's ears and walk away in disgust. The remaining crowd was now mostly made up of people who enjoyed watching conflict and drama. They cheered Marcus on, laughing at his increasingly desperate attempts to provoke the guard. This encouragement made Marcus feel powerful and important, something he had not felt in a very long time. Guard James Mitchell had been standing at his post for over 2 hours when the troublemaker first appeared. He had been trained for exactly this type of situation during his months of preparation for royal duty. His instructors had taught him that maintaining discipline and composure was not just about following orders, it was about representing his country, his regiment, and the royal family with honor and dignity. James could hear every word that Marcus was saying, but he had learned to focus his mind on other things. He thought about his family back home, his girlfriend Sarah, who was waiting for him to finish his service and his plans for the future. He reminded himself that this drunk man's opinions meant nothing to him and that responding would only encourage more bad behavior. The training had been intense and thorough. James and his fellow guards had practiced ignoring all kinds of distractions. They had been shouted at, had objects thrown near them, and had been tested in every way their instructors could imagine. They learned that their job was not just to look impressive for tourists, but to be ready to protect the royal family at a moment's notice if real danger appeared. As Marcus's behavior became more aggressive, James noticed something in the man's eyes that concerned him. There was a wildness there, a desperation that suggested the situation might escalate beyond simple verbal harassment. James had been taught to recognize the signs of someone who might become physically violent, and he was beginning to see those warning signs in Marcus. Despite his training, James was still human, and he felt his patience being tested more severely than it ever had been before. The insults about his family were particularly hard to ignore, and he had to work extra hard to keep his expression neutral. He knew that other guards were watching from their positions, and he did not want to let down his unit or disappoint his commanding officers. The crowd around them continued to grow, and James could sense that the situation was building toward something dangerous. He began to prepare himself mentally for whatever might happen next, knowing that his training would guide him through whatever challenges Marcus might present. He also knew that his fellow guards and the police officers stationed nearby were ready to step in if the situation required their intervention. Marcus was becoming increasingly angry and frustrated with the guards' complete lack of response. In his drunken state, he decided that verbal harassment was not enough. He needed to do something more dramatic to get the reaction he was desperately seeking. Without thinking about the consequences, Marcus crossed the rope barrier and stepped into the restricted area around the guard's post. The moment Marcus's foot touched the forbidden ground, everything changed. James Mitchell's training kicked in immediately, and he reacted with the swift precision of a highly trained soldier. In one fluid motion, James stepped forward, lowered his rifle to a defensive position, and shouted in a voice that echoed across the courtyard, "Stand back! Do not approach!" The crowd gasped and stepped backward. Many people had never heard a royal guard speak before, and the power and authority in James's voice was shocking. Marcus froze for a moment, suddenly realizing that he had crossed a serious line. But his pride and the alcohol in his system prevented him from backing down immediately. Instead of retreating, Marcus took another step forward, thinking he could still intimidate the guard. He raised his hands as if he might try to touch James's uniform or rifle. This second aggressive move triggered an even stronger response from the trained soldier. James moved with lightning speed that surprised everyone watching. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and took a strong defensive stance that clearly communicated he was ready to use force if necessary. His voice became even more commanding as he shouted, "Move away now! This is your final warning!" At the same time, James's movements had alerted the other guards and security personnel in the area. Within seconds, police officers who had been stationed nearby came running toward the scene. Additional guards from other posts began moving to support their fellow soldier, creating an impressive display of coordinated military response. Marcus suddenly found himself surrounded by several armed guards and police officers, all of whom looked very serious and ready to take action. The crowd had grown much larger, but now they were keeping a much safer distance. People were taking pictures and videos of the confrontation, and Marcus realized that his actions were being recorded by dozens of smartphones. The lead police officer, Sergeant Williams, stepped forward and addressed Marcus in a firm but professional tone. "Sir, you need to step back immediately and move away from the restricted area. You are interfering with the duties of Her Majesty's Guard, which is a serious offense under British law." Marcus looked around at all the serious faces surrounding him. The alcohol was beginning to wear off, and he was starting to understand the gravity of his situation. He could see that these men were not playing games or putting on a show for tourists. They were trained professionals who took their responsibilities very seriously, and he had crossed a line that they would not tolerate. For the first time since this whole incident began, Marcus felt genuine fear. The guards were not just ceremonial figures in fancy uniforms. They were real soldiers with real weapons and the authority to use them if necessary. He realized that his stupid prank had put him in danger of being arrested or even worse. James remained in his defensive position, watching Marcus carefully for any sign of continued aggression. His training had taught him to be ready for anything, and he was prepared to escalate his response if Marcus made any more threatening moves. The other guards formed a protective semicircle, creating a barrier between Marcus and the palace. The tourists in the crowd were now completely silent, sensing the tension in the air. Many of them were visitors from other countries who had never seen British police and military personnel in action before. They were witnessing a side of British authority that most tourists never experience, and it was both impressive and intimidating. Marcus's hands began to shake as he realized how many people were now focused on him. What had started as a simple attempt to embarrass a guard had turned into a serious confrontation with multiple law enforcement officers. He could see that the situation was spiraling out of control, and he needed to make a decision about what to do next. Marcus tried to back down, raising his hands and saying, Okay, I'm sorry. I was just having some fun." But Sergeant Williams was not impressed by this sudden change in attitude. He had seen too many troublemakers try to talk their way out of consequences after crossing serious lines. "Sir, you have violated several laws today," the sergeant said firmly. "You entered a restricted security area, you interfered with the duties of military personnel, and you created a public disturbance. We need to take you into custody." Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. "Come on, I didn't hurt anyone, I was just messing around." But even as he spoke these words, he knew how hollow they sounded. The crowd around him included families with small children who had been frightened by his behavior, and elderly tourists who had been forced to move away for their safety. 2 police officers moved closer to Marcus, preparing to arrest him. As they approached, Marcus made a terrible decision that would make his situation much worse. Instead of cooperating, he decided to try to run away. He pushed past one of the officers and started running toward the street, hoping to disappear into the crowds of London. This attempt to flee triggered an immediate response from all the security personnel in the area. James and the other guards maintained their positions to protect the palace, but the police officers and additional security guards who had arrived on the scene gave chase. Within moments, Marcus found himself being pursued by several trained law enforcement officers through the busy streets near Buckingham Palace. The chase did not last long. Marcus was out of shape from weeks of drinking and poor eating, while the officers chasing him were physically fit and trained for exactly this type of situation. Within 2 blocks, they had caught up with him and tackled him to the ground in front of dozens of shocked pedestrians. As Marcus lay on the pavement with his hands being cuffed behind his back, he finally began to understand the full consequences of his actions. The officers who arrested him were not gentle. They had been forced to chase him through crowded streets, which could have endangered innocent people. Their patience with his behavior had completely run out. Back at the palace, James Mitchell had returned to his ceremonial position, but the incident had affected him more than he let show. He was proud that he had handled the situation according to his training, but he was also troubled by the hatred and desperation he had seen in Marcus's eyes. James came from a working-class family himself, and he understood that people sometimes made bad choices when their lives were falling apart. The crowd of tourists gradually dispersed, but many of them continued to talk about what they had witnessed. Some were impressed by the professionalism and quick response of the guards and police. Others felt sorry for Marcus and thought the authorities had been too harsh. A few visitors from countries with less strict security were shocked by how seriously the British took any threat to their royal family. News of the incident began to spread quickly through social media. The videos that tourists had recorded with their phones were being shared online, and Marcus's face was becoming recognizable to people around the world. What he had intended as a private moment of rebellion had become a very public humiliation that would follow him for years to come. As Marcus was transported to the police station, he finally had time to think clearly about what had happened. The alcohol had worn off completely, and he was beginning to feel the full weight of his poor decisions. He realized that his attempt to make himself feel better by humbling a royal guard had instead revealed his own lack of character and self-control. Why? Police officers who were processing his arrest were professional but unsympathetic. They had seen many people like Marcus before, individuals who thought they could cause trouble without facing real consequences. They explained to him that he would be charged with several serious offenses that could result in significant fines, and possibly even jail time. Marcus thought about his family and how they would react when they found out about his arrest. His mother had always been proud of Britain's royal traditions, and she would be horrified to learn that her son had disrespected the royal guard. His father, a veteran of the British Army, would be even more disappointed in Marcus's behavior toward a fellow soldier. At the police station, Marcus was placed in a small, cold cell where he had nothing to do but think about his actions. The reality of his situation began to sink in as he realized he would have to call someone to help him with bail money. His girlfriend had already left him. His friends were tired of his problems, and his family was disappointed in him. He had no idea who he could turn to for help. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins was assigned to handle Marcus's case. She had investigated many incidents involving tourists and troublemakers at royal sites, and she took these cases very seriously. The Royal Guard was not just a tourist attraction, it was an important part of Britain's national security, and anyone who interfered with their duties was threatening the safety of the royal family. During the interview, Detective Collins reviewed the evidence against Marcus. There were dozens of witness statements from tourists who had seen his behavior, multiple video recordings from smartphones, and security camera footage from around the palace. The evidence was overwhelming and clear. Marcus had deliberately harassed a guard, entered a restricted area, and then tried to flee when arrested. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Collins said, looking across the interview table at Marcus, "you're facing some serious charges here. Interfering with military duties, trespassing in a security zone, disturbing the peace, and resisting arrest. These are not minor offenses. Marcus tried to explain that he had been drinking and was going through a difficult time in his life. But Detective Collins had heard these excuses many times before. Many people have problems in their lives, she said. Most of them don't take out their frustrations on people who are just doing their jobs. The detective explained that Marcus's case would go to court, where a judge would decide his punishment. Depending on how seriously the court viewed his actions, he could face substantial fines, community service, or even a short prison sentence. More importantly, he would have a criminal record that could affect his ability to find employment in the future. Meanwhile, back at his barracks, James Mitchell was discussing the incident with his fellow guards. Many of them had experienced similar situations with drunk or aggressive tourists, but most troublemakers backed down before things escalated to the level that Marcus had taken it. James felt good about how he had handled the situation, but he also felt some sympathy for the man who had clearly been struggling with personal problems. The training worked exactly like it was supposed to, James told his roommate that evening. But I keep thinking about how angry and desperate that guy looked. I wonder what was going through his mind to make him think that bothering a guard would solve his problems. James's commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, called him into his office the next day to discuss the incident. "You handled yourself perfectly out there, Mitchell," the captain said. "You followed protocol exactly, and you protected both yourself and the public. That's exactly what we expect from our guards." The captain explained that incidents like this were becoming more common as social media encouraged people to try increasingly dramatic stunts for attention. "Some people think we're just decoration," he said. "They don't understand that we're real soldiers with real responsibilities. What you did yesterday reminded everyone that we take our duties seriously." News outlets began picking up the story, and it became a talking point about respect for authority and the consequences of poor behavior. Some commentators praised the guards and police for their professional response, while others argued that the punishment seemed too harsh for what appeared to be a harmless prank gone wrong. Marcus's mother, Helen Thompson, saw the news reports and immediately recognized her son in the videos that were being shown on television. She was heartbroken to see Marcus being arrested and humiliated in front of the world. She had always hoped that he would eventually get his life together, but this incident seemed to represent a new low in his downward spiral. Helen decided to visit Marcus in jail before his court appearance. When she saw him sitting in the visiting room, she could see that he was genuinely ashamed of what he had done. "I'm so sorry, Mum," he said, tears in his eyes. "I know I've disappointed you and Dad. I just felt so angry about everything, and I wanted to make someone else feel as bad as I did." His mother listened as Marcus explained how lost and hopeless he had been feeling since losing his job and his girlfriend. She could see that her son was finally beginning to understand the connection between his actions and their consequences. "Marcus," she said, "you can't solve your problems by creating new ones. You need to take responsibility for your choices and start making better decisions." 3 weeks later, Marcus stood in Westminster Magistrates' Court facing Judge Patricia Hammond. The courtroom was packed with reporters and curious observers who had followed the story in the news. Marcus wore his only clean suit and tried to look as respectful as possible, but he knew that his actions at Buckingham Palace had already been seen by millions of people around the world. Judge Hammond reviewed the case carefully before delivering her verdict. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "your behavior was not only illegal but also deeply disrespectful to institutions that represent the best of British tradition and service. The royal guard you harassed was a young man doing his duty with honor and discipline, qualities that you clearly lack." The judge sentenced Marcus to 6 months of community service, a substantial fine, and mandatory alcohol counseling. She also issued a restraining order that banned him from coming within 500 meters of any royal residence or military installation. "Perhaps," she said, "spending time helping others will teach you the value of service and respect that you so clearly need to learn." Marcus accepted the sentence without argument. He knew he was lucky not to be going to prison, and he was determined to use this opportunity to turn his life around. The community service would involve working at a homeless shelter, where he would help people who were struggling with problems even worse than his own. On his first day at the shelter, Marcus met Robert Chen, the director who would supervise his community service. Robert had worked with many court-ordered volunteers over the years, and he had a good sense of which ones were genuinely committed to change and which ones were just going through the motions to satisfy their legal requirements. "I've seen the videos of what you did," Robert told Marcus directly. "I'm not interested in hearing excuses or apologies. What I want to know is whether you're ready to actually help people or if you're just here to serve your time and leave." Marcus was surprised by Robert's bluntness, but he appreciated the honesty. "I want to help," he said. "I know what I did was wrong, and I want to make up for it somehow. I just don't know how to start." Over the following months, Marcus worked hard at the homeless shelter. He served meals, cleaned facilities, and most importantly, listened to the stories of people who had lost everything through addiction, mental illness, and economic hardship. Many of these individuals had made worse mistakes than Marcus, but they were working every day to rebuild their lives with dignity and determination. One evening, Marcus was talking with an elderly veteran named Frank, who had been homeless for several years. Frank had served in the military decades earlier and still had great respect for the Royal Guard and other military units. When he learned about Marcus's incident at Buckingham Palace, he was initially angry and disappointed. "That young guard was doing his job," Frank said. "He was representing all of us who ever wore a uniform. When you disrespected him, you disrespected every person who ever served this country." But as Frank got to know Marcus better, he began to see that the younger man was genuinely trying to change. Frank became something of a mentor to Marcus, helping him understand the importance of discipline, respect, and service to others. "You can't change what you did," Frank told him, "but you can decide what kind of person you want to be from now on." Meanwhile, James Mitchell continued his service with the Royal Guard, eventually being promoted for his professionalism during the incident with Marcus. He never forgot the desperate look in the troublemaker's eyes, and he sometimes wondered what had become of the man whose life had intersected so dramatically with his own. By the end of his community service, Marcus had transformed significantly. He had completed his alcohol counseling program, found a new job at a construction company that valued his experience, and begun rebuilding relationships with his family. Most importantly, he had learned to find purpose and self-worth through helping others rather than tearing them down. On his final day at the homeless shelter, Marcus asked Robert if he could continue volunteering even though his court-ordered service was complete. "I've learned more about myself in these 6 months than I did in the previous 10 years, Marcus said. "I want to keep helping people if you'll let me." Robert smiled and shook Marcus's hand. "I was hoping you'd ask," he said. "We can always use volunteers who understand what it's like to hit rock bottom and work their way back up." Marcus never returned to Buckingham Palace, but he often thought about the young guard whose professionalism and dignity had ultimately helped change his life. He realized that the Royal Guards had indeed given no quarter to his troublemaking behavior, but in doing so, they had forced him to confront the person he had become and inspired him to become someone better.